wanted to go back to our conversation with Rick Shafton about Chris Christie in the last hour. Rick Shafton said, look, he's an experienced pollster and consultant, works with the Republican Party, conservative candidates. He said, look, it's just too early to tell what's going to happen with Chris Christie, if he can bounce back from this. I think for a lot of conservatives, he's just too liberal. Frankly, he's an undocumented Democrat in the eyes of a lot of people in the conservative base, but you never know. And I think the big money guys in the Republican Party are pretty panicked that Chris Christie is in such trouble because they were counting on him. They were banking on him, which I believe is one of the reasons why the Obama administration, and with the resources at their disposal, they are trying to take him out. They're trying to neutralize Chris Christie because they genuinely were afraid of him because of the way he was polling, for instance, against Hillary Clinton. So they wanted to obliterate him. Now here is Chris Matthews. This is just an audio bite, but Chris Matthews, again, talking about a possible matchup between Chris Christie and Hillary Clinton. Here's what he had to say.
When you make a list, one guy could really go on national television against Hillary Clinton as a sort of a middle-of-the-road Republican. The rest are all far to the right. The Republican Party, no matter what you think of it, rarely runs a right-winger. They tend to, in the end, running McCain or Romney. In the end, they get practical because they really want that White House. They really want it. And you can't. That's why you're left with Rand Paul and Ted Cruz. They're not going to be elected president of the United States. So now they got to go back to Jeb. Let's go back to the Bushes again. Let's try them one more time. And that's what everybody's talking about right now because, Republicans are not crazy. They're not going to run a right-winger. So, and the only guy that could have won, I think Christie would have been a candidate before this mess.
So Chris Matthews is saying it's a done deal. We got Hillary Clinton in 2016. Chris Christie is the only one that could have beaten Hillary Clinton. He's been neutralized by Bridgegate. He's done. Republicans aren't stupid enough to run a conservative. They understand. This is what's crazy about what Chris Matthews is saying. It's like he's saying the Republicans are smart enough to understand that they've got to repeat the same strategy they used with McCain and Romney. They got to run somebody that's in the middle. And that's the ticket. That's the secret to success. I mean, it's just absurd. Every time they run one of those guys, Bob Dole in 96, run John McCain in 2008, run Mitt Romney in 2012, they get their clocks cleaned. They get plowed. And yet the meme still persists in the part of the left, like Chris Matthews, and part of the right, the GOP elites, got to run a moderate or a centrist. But if you understand what Chris Matthews is saying, where they honestly think that Chris Christie was the only threat to Hillary Clinton, then you can see why they're putting all their energies into taking him out. But it's interesting. Chris Matthews admitting in that soundbite that, look, running undocumented Democrats like McCain and Romney, it doesn't work. It hasn't worked for the Republican Party. Now, there's one other aspect to this. Let's go down to clip 11, Rob. One other aspect to this business about the focus on Chris Christie. And I want to play this soundbite. Then I got a couple other examples of the same thing that we're kind of talking about here from a media standpoint and from a legal standpoint. This is Jake Tapper on with Hugh Hewitt. And what Jake Tapper and Hugh Hewitt are doing is evaluating the relative amount of media attention that's been given to Chris Christie's troubles and the amount that's been given to Hillary Clinton and her problems with Benghazi. I probably don't have time to get into it today, but the whistleblower in that situation, Greg Hicks, is saying, look, this whole thing was Hillary's fault. Everybody's out there trying to blame the dead guy, Ambassador Stevens, and Greg Hicks is saying, no, this was the fault of Hillary Clinton and the State Department. And so what Hugh Hewitt and Jake Tapper from CNN are doing are comparing the relative amount of attention that these two scandals, if you want to call them that, have received. Let's listen.
But we don't know what she did that night, do we, Jake Tapper? And no one bothers her about it. She's been allowed to walk away, whereas Christie trucked us a bunch of subpoenas 2 weeks later.
Hillary Clinton, I do not know what she did that night. I do think that, she was, look, I'm not trying to make excuses for anybody. I'm just trying to look at the perspective of, Christie is an incumbent governor. He has an adversarial Democratic legislature. They are launching subpoenas. Christie, it's also the nature of Christie to go out there and give a 2-hour-plus press conference and answer all those questions, although he has laid low since then, but still, that was one of the longest press conferences in modern American politics. Hillary Clinton was on her way out, and, I can't tackle her, and I haven't had a chance to interview her since Benghazi happened. I don't even know, has she done interviews? I think she did some interviews on her way out.
So, Jake Tapper is saying, look, the amount of attention that's been given is completely inequitable. I mean, nobody's talking about what Hillary Clinton was doing the night the Benghazi attack went down. She hasn't done any press conferences. At least Chris Christie went out and spent 107 minutes answering questions. And Jake Tapper admits, look, I haven't even been able to talk to Hillary Clinton since this thing happened. She has gone to ground, made herself completely unavailable. And, the network coverage of that Benghazi thing, they did not mention the name of President Obama one single time. They had the Senate report that came out, and it was a bipartisan report, said, look, this was a preventable attack. And remember, this is from the Senate, so it's got Democrats as well as Republicans. Democrats are in charge of these committees. So it couldn't have happened unless you had Democrats that were willing to sign on to this report that said that this attack was preventable and that the fault could be traced back to the State Department. But none of the reports mention anything about Barack Obama, even though this is his administration. And here, I just want to grab this before we go back to the phones here. This is Gregory Hicks. Gregory Hicks, remember, was on site that night when everything happened. He was in Tripoli. He was the one talking to Ambassador Stevens when the phone cut out because Ambassador Stevens was being slaughtered, being sodomized and then murdered. And so Greg Hicks is responding to this effort on the part of the media and the left to smear Chris Stevens, which is despicable to me because he's dead. He's not around to tell his side of the story, not around to defend himself. So they're picking on the dead guy, which I find personally reprehensible. But Gregory Hicks, he concluded, or he starts off his piece in the Wall Street Journal by saying, look, the report from the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence concluded that the attack, which resulted in the murder of 4 Americans, was preventable. Some have suggested that the blame for this tragedy lies at least partly with Ambassador Chris Stevens, who was killed. This is untrue. The blame lies entirely with Washington. On August 1st, 2012, the day after I arrived in Tripoli, Chris invited me to a video conference with AFRICOM, that's the military command in Africa, discussing changing the mission of the U.S. Special Forces from protecting the U.S. Embassy and its personnel to training Libyan forces. So in other words, the military was no longer going to be responsible to protect the U.S. Embassy. Their job was now going to be to train Libyan forces. This change in mission would result in the transfer of authority over the unit in Tripoli from Chris to General Ham. In other words, the special forces would report to the Defense Department, not state. So this Chris Stevens would lose the ability to direct the special forces and deploy them in order to provide protection. Chris had requested on July 9th by cable that Washington provide a minimum of 13 American security professionals for Libya over and above the diplomatic security complement of 8 assigned to Tripoli and Benghazi. On July 11, the Defense Department, apparently in response to Chris's request, offered to extend the Special Forces mission to protect the U.S. Embassy. However, on July 13, State Department Undersecretary Patrick Kennedy refused the Defense Department offer and thus Chris's July 9th request. So in other words, he's saying, look, Ambassador Stevens was asking for help. He had 8 people there to provide security. He said, we need 13 more. We're undermanned. We're underprotected. He passed that request on. It was passed up the chain of command by General Ham. Said, look, I think these guys need more special forces in place to protect them. It was the State Department, it was Washington that turned down Ambassador Stevens' request for additional security. So he says this, to sum up, Chris Stevens was not responsible for the reduction in security personnel. His requests for additional security were denied or ignored. Officials at the state and defense departments in Washington made the decisions that resulted in reduced security. So Greg Hicks, the one in position to know, said, look, this is Hillary Clinton's State Department's fault all the way. Let's go to Brandon, Mount Vernon, Illinois. Brandon, thanks for calling. Thanks for waiting. What's on your mind?
I just wanted to say, I think as a nation, I think we're seeing the perplexity of nations, basically. And basically the confusion. I've never seen it this way ever.
Yeah.
And I'm rather young, so I mean, if something don't change for the positive, it's gonna. I'm afraid we're over. We're done.
Well, and we had that piece yesterday. I talked about Megyn Kelly using the impeachment word with regard to President Obama, and the piece from Nat Hentoff, who's a famous liberal, civil libertarian, said, we've never seen anything like this before. We've never seen this level of lawlessness. We've never seen this level of defiance of the law and defiance of the Constitution. And it's bleeding into other areas. That's a concern that we all ought to have. Down in Virginia, we haven't talked about it much, but the Attorney General in Virginia voted for the marriage amendment there in 2006. It passed with 57% of the vote. So the people of Virginia went to the polls and said, we want to protect marriage as one man, one woman. And the Attorney General, who's a Democrat, just got elected, hasn't been in office 2 months, or he hadn't been in office 2 weeks when he did this. He said, I'm not going to defend our marriage amendment. Even though my sworn duty is to defend the laws and the Constitution of the state of Virginia, I'm not going to do it. Even though I voted for it, my personal feelings have evolved on this issue, and I no longer support natural marriage being protected in our Constitution. So I'm not going to defend it. And not only am I not going to defend it, I'm going to lead the charge against it. I, as the Attorney General, with a sworn oath to protect this Constitution, I'm going to do my best to subvert it. So this is essentially treason against the people of Virginia. And I think the point here, Brandon, is this is something that isn't contained now within the White House. I mean, this Attorney General sees what Eric Holder does. They just ignore the laws they don't like. Sees what President Obama does. He just ignores the laws he doesn't like. Eric Holder's out there saying, hey, if banks want to have drug money, marijuana money, even though it breaks federal law, knock yourself out. We're not going to prosecute anybody who launders marijuana drug money. Just in defiance of the law. And so, Brandon, I think your point is well taken. We're dealing with something that's really unprecedented in American history. We have never seen anything this blatant, this defiant, this kind of bold-faced lawlessness on the part of the President of the United States. And again, Brandon, I'm with you. I don't know how much longer this can continue without something having to break loose. Focal Point, AFR Talk.